Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the studio. This week we have a short excerpt of a longer Patreon exclusive video. So if you want to watch the full video and many more like it, head over to my Patreon page, patreon.com/Eirik Arnesen. There's a link in the description below. On the back here, you see a clear example of the rough blocking. This is still very rough. The most important thing to note is that the rough blocking is not random, though the shapes and clay application is rough. At this stage, each of these rough shapes directly corresponds with something on my reference. So there's a clear connection visually between reference and my sculpture. Without this connection, I would get lost in the forest of forms without any clear path ahead. So in many ways, the block-in isn't as rough as it seems, I guess. It's actually a fairly simple matter to begin rendering this rough block-in a little and bring it closer to the reality of my reference. It shouldn't take too much work. Not only should you consider the reference while blocking in order for the sculpture to visually correspond with the reference, so comparison is easy, you should consider anatomy as well. Observing your reference and make sure that the rough block-in corresponds well with natural human anatomy. It's very easy to get lost in a sea of forms while looking at a model or reference, but with a little bit of grounding in actual human anatomy, knowledge of actual human anatomy, the forms will make a lot more sense and be easier to identify on both sculpture and reference, and easier to make as well. Consider taking a look at ancient Greek sculpture and how they dealt with anatomy there. Now, for us, it feels quite schematic the way that they did it, at least in some examples of Greek work. But following a similar schematic approach in your blocking and then later adding more complexity on top of that is a way of sculpture, a way of sculpting that has worked out for me time and time again. It's not that you don't look at the reference while blocking in, but you attempt to fit what the reference provides you with into the schematic so that it all makes sense visually. Anything you can do to help yourself see and make sense of it all is going to help you progress your sculpture. Speaking of this Greek schematic, consider the 3 rules of blocking in that we spoke about in episode 3. These all have a lot to do with how the Greeks sculpted. These 3 rules of blocking in are symmetry in width on either side of the center line, symmetry in angle breaks on either side of the center line, and symmetry in the internal information on either side of the center line. And if you imagine yourself applying all those 3, you can see how the sculpture you would end up with would look quite schematic and quite Greek in a sense. These 3 rules are there to help you get to that slightly schematic block-in so that you can later add more complexity in the shape design, the volume, and the transitions. Very simply put, follow these 3 rules, then vary the values in the transitions on either side of the center line to correspond with the action that your sculpture is performing, and you'll have a fairly organic and pretty good looking result. Of course, it's never that easy. There's always stumbling block and issues that we run into, but if you wanted to make it sound simple, that's exactly how I would describe it. And broken down on the most basic level, that's kind of what it's like. One thing that happened on the back was that where the contours and forms initially were established proved to be way too far in. In other words, the sculpture was too narrow from the side view in the pelvic region. So I needed to expand them outwards quite a bit. And this is another one of those mistakes that I spoke about at the beginning of the video. I begin this process by pulling the outer contours from the side view out to increase the width. This contour is going to be my outer border, and while I work from the back view, where I can't properly observe the contours from the side view, I will not change or pull these contours in any direction. Once the width and the nature of the outer contour is re-established, I can use the previously established forms that now exists way too far in behind the contour and pull those out further so that how much the contour overlaps them from the side view matches my reference. I judge this by observing from the side view and see how much of the contour is covered by the forms that lay behind them, essentially. Or when I'm observing from the side view, the forms that are closer to me. And then I pull the forms out so that not too much or the exact amount of contour that I need to show is showing. Essentially, I'm looking for how much width one form takes up compared to another. And all of these judgments must be made from the side view. However, it's also important to note that as long as I'm within reason here, I'm going to be good. This doesn't really have to be exact, because judging it is virtually impossible anyways. Judging it super accurately is virtually impossible. It's not like the contour. So this is not accurate to the same level or degree that I attempt to make the contour accurate, for example. As long as the forms I pull out continue to stay behind the contour, I'm going to be fairly safe. There are areas where I make it my mission to be close to 100% accurate, for example the contour, and there are areas where I know that the accuracy can be closer to 75 or 80% perhaps. So knowing where to apply yourself extremely diligently and where you can get away with a little bit more can sometimes be important. This also means I have a lot more freedom to work and to make decisions, design decisions, in areas that exists behind the contours. While doing this, I'm making sure that I don't haphazardly change the way that the forms are drawn. I pay close attention, ask myself the same questions that I asked earlier, and then I try to improve upon the drawing. We spoke about this at length earlier in this very episode. I'm also beginning to turn the forms and making sure they are not super flat, giving them a bit of volume. To begin with, it's important to simply keep in mind that as long as the forms stay within the border that was established for that particular form and doesn't come out further than any of the outer contours, you're probably going to be fine. Now, of course, if you followed this advice too literary, you would end up with a very strange result. But it's a fine place to start, and as long as some volume is added so that the sculpture's volumes begin to resemble the volume present on the reference, you're probably going to be good. It's very hard actually to add too much volume, a lot harder than you would think. You almost always end up needing more volume than you would think that you need, and this is why I leave the volumetric considerations until the very end, where I find that volumes can most easily be judged. However, if the gap between where I am and where I need to go at that time is too large, I won't be able to make the jump without needing to backtrack significantly. I won't be able to make the jump without running into a lot of issues. So shrinking that gap now by adding a common sense amount of volume is both valuable and will save me a lot of headache in the future. I try to keep in mind the bony structures existing underneath the surface while working. On the back, the big ones that must be considered carefully are the scapulas, also known as the shoulder blades. The shoulder blades I decided to highlight and talk about here because they do not actually follow the 3 rules of blocking in as neatly as we would perhaps like. The scapulas move independently of each other, and therefore symmetry on either side of the center line might not be possible. Of course we could have it, but it depends on the position of the arms. Where we do need symmetry, however, is in the shape. Each scapula should be the same shape and the same height and width, even if they are not in the same position. So I make sure that's the case by measuring using a tool or sometimes my hands. Roughly put, the scapulas are 2 big, upside down L shapes, with a little bit more complexity to them than that, but that's a good place to start. I try to make sure that the bony structures that we can see on the surface, which is the edge of the scapula, are symmetrical, in appearance but not in position of course. And then I treat the internal information inside the scapulas on a less anatomical level and much more on a shape level. By thinking of the shapes and visually referencing my model, I do end up with anatomically correct information usually. But the scapulas have such seemingly random selection of shapes, and depending on position of the scapula, what the arms are doing, etc., the shapes can be quite random, or seem quite random at least. And they can be quite different from side to side as well. So, in an area like the scapula, I try not to get too bogged down with the anatomy. And it needs to be made clear here that I'm talking about the anatomy of the fleshy forms, the muscles, and not the anatomy of the bones. A lot of times you can get away with a lot when it comes to the softer tissue forms, as long as the bones are very solid and structurally sound. Think of the bones as the foundation that the fleshy forms are hanging off of. As long as the bones are very well considered and very structurally sound, you can pull the forms that are muscles between them fairly easily and end up with a convincing result. Now that's not to say that you should sculpt bones first and then the muscles. But at some point you should consider what each form you've placed on your figure represent, and treat them somewhat differently if they are bone or muscle. Knowing, for example, that bones should be more symmetrical, extra symmetrical, a little bit more mechanical, a little bit more architectural, affords you the opportunity to then let the forms that are muscles or fat be a little bit more organic in nature. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as I said at the top, this is an excerpt of a longer Patreon exclusive video, part 7 of my Patreon exclusive video series. So if you want to see more, support the channel, or get feedback on your own work, then check out my Patreon page. There's a link in the description below the video. Thank you for watching, stay creative, and I hope to see you in the next one.